Thanks to our panelists. That was terrific. And as our moderator said, lots more to talk about, which we'll have time later this afternoon. My name is Ann Peters. I'm with the Pulitzer Center, and it's really been an honor working with Berkeley journalism to create this programming. And I would like to introduce you to our next session on the blue economy and how our oceans can foster an economy that improves livelihoods, preserves ocean health, and combats climate change in safe and ethical ways. We're pleased to welcome several speakers today at this session. Alexandra Talty, a Pulitzer Center 2023 Ocean Reporting Fellow who has extensively covered the seaweed industry and the blue economy. Rod Fujita, marine ecologist with the Environmental Defense Fund, who studies the safety of carbon capture. Thiago Correa, from the Energy and Biosciences Institute at UC Berkeley. We'll have as our moderator Dan Okamoto, a UC Berkeley scientist who studies coastal ecological dynamics and resource management. And to kick off the session, I'd like to welcome Alexandra.
I have to say, usually I'm not prepped, but with a seaweed movie, like usually I'm kind of the passionate seaweed person, but I feel like this has worked out very well for me. So I'm going to be sharing about my year-long investigative project into the American seaweed industry. It was part of the Pulitzer Center's Ocean Reporting Network, and I was hosted and mentored by Civil Eats, and it's really special because actually the editor-in-chief, Margot True, is here today, and she spent a lot of late nights and early mornings on this project. So this is the final product. It took a lot of work to get here, so I'm going to kind of walk you through like why we wanted to do this project, what's important about it, and some of the insights that we found through the reporting. So you guys know some of these already from the movie, which again, doesn't always happen. But basically in the past 5 years in the US, there's been a ton of investment into the seaweed industry. So seaweed farming has existed in Asia for hundreds of years, and seaweed has been wild harvested on the coastlines all over the world by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. So seaweed is not new in any means of imagination, but seaweed farming is quite new in the United States. And part of the reason why are these fun kelp facts. Now, I'm going to say seaweed and kelp pretty interchangeably. Most of the farmed seaweed in the United States is kelp, which is a brown seaweed, as we learned earlier, Saccharinina latissima. But so basically kelp, because it can grow so fast and so well, it's been highlighted as a way to potentially decarbonize industries like textile, plastic, and fuel. And it grows without any input, so no fertilizer, it doesn't need water, and it pulls down anywhere between 5 to 10 times more carbon while it grows than trees. And it also fights some of the biggest of climate change's effects on the ocean. By deacidifying water as it grows, it can remove harmful excess nutrients like nitrogen. And then if it's consumed as a food product, it has a lot of iodine and micronutrients. And it can also be used for soil bioremediation. And so this is a photo that I took of an open ocean kelp farm off the coast of Santa Barbara, which we'll get to a little bit later. And that is bull kelp. So what were the goals with this project? So in 5 years, there's been hundreds of millions of investment into this industry, but that information isn't really publicly available. So we wanted to publish new information around the investments into the seaweed industry, looking specifically at public and private funders, and then trying to make sure that, that the money is going to who the industry is kind of positively supporting, right? So a big reason why people say we should be investing in seaweeds is to kind of uplift marine economies that may be dependent on extractive industries like commercial fishing or even shellfish farmers who have seen a huge change because of oceans acidification. So making sure that this money that has been promised to these people is actually going there. And then we wanted to visit both the heart of the small-scale seaweed farming industry in the United States, which is in Portland, Maine, and then also visit the world's first ocean open seaweed farm, which is off the coast of Santa Barbara. And then also trace the story of seaweed science in the United States. You guys got to meet Dr. Charlie Yaresh, who is indeed the grandfather of seaweed. So we traced some of his science, as well as Dr. Kim, who was featured in that film as well, because the initial driver for investment in seaweed farming in the United States has been because of the scientists and because of these insights that they found about kelp that has driven a lot of, at first, the federal funding, and now we're seeing kind of like venture capital catch up. So the challenges are that it's a new form of aquaculture. So, in America, as American journalists, we're really lucky. A lot of things are tracked like pretty well by the USDA, NOAA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And very early on this project, we realized that none of those federal agencies claimed any oversight into this industry. So there was nowhere to see this information. And, for my purposes, that made it challenging because I had to go to, individual farms, collate that information, go state to state. And then you're also always double checking things, right? Because, a farmer, it might sound really good if they said that they harvested 10,000 pounds of kelp. But if I'm going to publish that, I need to make sure that that is actually true. The other thing that it's damaging for non-journalists is just that so much of investment into food production or textiles or things like that is driven by data, right? And so any other crop that's grown in the United States, like corn, soy, even things like goats that are raised, you can track on the USDA website back the past 100 years, you can track by county. So that's a huge opportunity loss. And this is also true for fish or shellfish or anything like that. So we wanted to kind of create a baseline information of where is seaweed being farmed, how much is it being farmed, and where is this investment going? So also because it's so new, a lot of the data was linked to funders. So that just requires a lot of extra fact checking. And, this is from the Open Ocean Farm. It's run by this Faroese company called Ocean Rainforest, and their goal is to decarbonize all these industries, and they're gonna do it through this open ocean farming. And one of the really interesting things about this series that we kind of realized was that there's kind of two ways that ocean farming is happening. One is in these inshore environments where it's able to uplift these marine communities, and then one is in these offshore contexts. And this is the world's first ever open ocean farm. It's 5 miles off of Santa Barbara. It doesn't look super impressive, but those yellow buoys are actually the size of a person. And so what they created was this way to, from the shore, if something became entangled or if there was a storm or an atmospheric river, they could look from the shore and make sure that this seaweed farm was still operational. Because offshore seaweed farming, you're talking about huge ocean currents. This was in 300 feet of water. And there's a big fear around either endangerment of marine mammals, endangerment of commercial fishers, endangerment of natural habitats, and also recreational fishers. So, but if seaweed is going to be able to decarbonize things like plastic, fuel, or textiles, we will have to have production in this kind of a format, because this is where you're going to be able to get the cost down, which is something I think that was also mentioned in that movie. So these were our kind of journalistic solutions to coming up with ways to report around something that's quite new. We used FOIA, in which we discovered that no one on the federal level is at all tracking where these seaweed farms are, which is not allowed. If you report on any other parts of the ocean, in the US, we track an oyster farm is here this year, or a crab trap, and no one is doing that for seaweed. At the time, I was told that there's 2 bills that will be passed when the Farm Bill is passed this year, but obviously there have been a lot of changes, and I don't think anyone at the USDA is trying to create new departments right now. So we're still waiting on the seaweed office. Okay, so these are kind of our big insights. We traced over $380 million of funding since 2017, and this was amazing. Civil Eats works with this great illustrator, Nat Nichols, and I think that, if you're doing ocean reporting or climate reporting, anytime you can use data visualization, it really helps. And as you can see, there's a huge drop off in investments. So we started calling this the seaweed winter. And over the course of my reporting, many companies were closing because there was kind of this huge hype around seaweeds as carbon sequestration, and a lot of investment in the food industry. And then when we dug into it, and then we also did these kind of like breakouts of seaweed investment by category, which a lot of this was like just finding our own data from scientists and then, tracing it all back. But we discovered a huge lack of investment into processing, which one of the interesting things about kelp, it's super easy to grow, but once it hits land, it has 24 hours before it begins to ferment. So it's really difficult. And you saw a little bit of that in the Korean part of the movie. But so we are nowhere near that level of infrastructure in the United States. I was visiting Portland, Maine, with Atlantic Sea Farms, the largest seaweed as food company in the United States. And they've kind of created this whole network across Maine, dependent on refrigerated trucks and hand cutting. But in places like Alaska, we've seen none of that kind of investment. So that's a huge hurdle for the seaweed industry. And, processing is like sometimes the least sexy part of these kinds of things. But one thing that we saw is that it's really needed if we are going to become competitive with Asian markets. And then this is actually the Shinnecock kelp farmers. I grew up alongside the Shinnecock tribe, and they invited me to share the story of their kelp farming collective. We saw them in the movie. This is Donna. And they are basically fighting ocean acidification to save their tribal territory by growing seaweeds. And this was really special for me personally to report on them because the bay that they are protecting is the bay that I grew up on and is very much linked to why I became an ocean journalist. And so this is actually the scientific principle behind why they're growing seaweeds to kind of save the shellfish, to save their nation. And again, data visualization makes this seem really easy. It's a very complex scientific concept. And this was me hand harvesting seaweed with the Shinnecock kelp farmers. They invited me. So thank you guys so much. And
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Jace, for inviting. Thanks, everybody. I have 12 slides. I'm going to run through it, and I really hope to finish before I see the end sign there. My name is Thiago Correa, and my co-worker here, my colleague is John Coates. We're both part of the Energy and Bioscience Institute here at Berkeley, EBI. And we just start the IBMC Center, which is the International Bioeconomy Macroalgae Seaweed Center, which is also here in Berkeley. We have some colleagues here that are also part of the center. This center is a newly funded NSF center, and it's part of a major global center. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But first, I want to explain why an energy institute has anything to do with macroalgae. So actually, EBI, the Energy and Bioscience Institute, was created to basically solve this dilemma here, food versus energy. And that's because the first generation of biofuel in the early 2000s used the edible part of the plant to generate biofuel. That was never going to work because if the energy price goes up, it would stress the supply chain of food and price would go up, would not work. So EBI actually was created to come up with the second generation of biofuel that used the residue of the agriculture to generate the bioenergy. But plants, as you have learned from Kathy Ann, during her video, is that plants, they have lignin, and it's extremely, what we learned after studying this for 20 years, they're extremely hard to break it down. So actually, we were chasing for a better feedstock for the bioeconomy that does not compete with terrestrial crops, does not use fertilizers and fresh water, and also doesn't have the lignin, because it's really difficult to break the lignin and it requires too much energy. And of course, seaweed comes up because it has all these qualities. You watch in the movie, Alexandra just pointed out as well, is the perfect feedstock for the bioeconomy. And you can create so many products, such as commodity chemicals, such as biofuel and bioplastics, but also is great for ecological service, such as bioremediation, because it extracts the nutrients and heavy metals, as well as the carbon sequestration. So that's why we created the IBMC under the EBI. So a little bit about the IBMC very quickly. The idea here is basically to facilitate the development of this industry here. It does need to upscale, as we have heard across the talks. And the idea is to do that through knowledge, innovation, new policies, very necessary, very difficult to do anything in California, for example, workforce development, and also the engagement with the coastal communities. And to do that, this global center is actually a combination of 8 countries, over now 50 institutions, and over 40 collaborators. And the great thing is that we're tackling the entire value chain of the seaweed industry, not just the biological basic science that usually we focus so much about it, but also to try to improve, to create advanced cultivation harvesting method, which is extremely necessary if you're going to do that upscale. Improve the process in conversions. I have some examples about that. Tackle the seaweed industries as a circular economy, not a linear. We need to use the residues to valorize and create products. It cannot be linear anymore. And of course, there is the entire socioeconomic aspect as well, because we rely on the coastal communities, and they have to be part of it. So that's the IBMC. But let me tell you a bit. You heard some of those numbers already, so I'm going to emphasize a few ones that we haven't heard yet. So yes, 97% of the seaweed today is through farming. Just 3% is through wild harvesting. So the majority here, the seaweed industry actually is very tiny. If you look at some numbers, it's between 12 and 17 billion the marketplace annually. Just to put that in context, the agriculture is $14 trillion per year. So it's 3 orders of magnitude smaller. So we're literally just scratching the surface. And the key players, I think you heard that as well, they're all Asian countries, 98%, basically China, Indonesia, and Korea. And it's all for food. And that's the main point of this talk here. Everything is related to food at this moment. And that's what I'm going to address in the next slides. And Korea is pretty much the big leader. You saw in the video, they are the ones that cultivating this in a more automated way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that anymore. But I'm going to spend 1 minute of my precious time to just walk you through these numbers, because actually that's a very interesting one. What can you do with seaweed besides food and energy? And my background is actually in energy is a big one. We know the technology that exists today, actually Yasu from the National Lab, he created a platform that can turn 1 ton of dry seaweed into 350 liters of ethanol. Okay, great. We know that the most difficult sector of the economy today to decarbonize is aviation. And we consume with fossil fuel 375 billion liters of jet fuel, fossil fuel jet fuels annually. Well, what if you use sustainable aviation fuel through seaweed to basically fulfill the entire demand of jet fuels? That would require an area of 43,000 square kilometers. Just make a quick conversion here. It's just ballpark numbers. But that's the area that you need to farm, a continuous farm, to generate the entire jet fuel that's necessary. Well, actually, 43,000 only represents 8% of the economic exclusive zone of California. So basically, it's the size of the Central Valley of California, which is full of agriculture crops, right? That's exactly the size that you need to basically create in the state of California, or elsewhere in the world, to basically fulfill the entire sustainable aviation fuel that's necessary to decarbonize the energy. Just some numbers here. But, of course, the big question here is, can we really do that? Can we really upscale the seaweed farming to get to that level in a sustainable way? Well, to learn that, we went to South Korea, actually, because as you heard, they are the guys, they're the people that are really pushing the limits here. That was a team, actually, there was a journalist in our team, and since I'm surrounded by journalists, I think you can guess who is the journalist here, because the only one that's holding a notepad. But basically, and we saw that in the movie as well, they are all focused on the paropial species, the game, right? And it's all about the food, and keep this in mind. So what we did, we looked through the entire value chain, the supply chain in South Korea to really understand what was going on. So all the way from hatchery, farming, the trading, the processing, and the product development. And I put some key words there to kind of talk a little bit each process. I'm going to try to walk a little bit for each one. But the key line, the key punchline of my talk is this one. There is an efficiency in subsidies across the entire value chain, because it's all about food quality. It's not about food quantity, it's about quality. And there are significant opportunities to improve and scale up. That's the learning that I took. So that's where we visit. It's the southwest part of South Korea. This area called Mokopu is actually the mecca of the seaweed for several reasons. You know, it's a shallow water environment, so it's good for that. It's very high nutrient that comes from Yongsan River. And it also has a really strong tidal current, which is good for the seaweed. The tide varies about 5 to 6 meters a day. And there's the traditional expertise. So all combined, this is the place to go, and that was the farm we visit. But just like agriculture, to grow seaweed, you need to hatch. You need the seeds, like the spores. And those are classic, the hatchery facilities that you see across this region. And actually, the South Koreans, that they came up with this artificial seeding method. They use oyster shells, consumed oyster shells, as attachment for the filament of the algae to grow. So they put those oyster shells in the floor horizontally in a dark kind of water, cool water. And they let it be there for a few weeks, couple months. And then once it's ready, they transfer to these tanks here, where they have these big wheels. That's the wheels that they put the nets that they're going to put into the ocean. And when they put into those tanks, they warm up the water and they expose to light. So the filaments actually move from the oyster shell detached, goes to the net. This is extremely energy intensive. You have to first pump the seawater, then you have to warm up the water. And when the nets are done, they put in this giant freezer that's minus 20 degrees, because it's basically the Amazon of the seeded net. If the farmer needs the net, it's ready to go. It's great, but it's subsidized by the government. So that's the farm that we visit. There's two technologies. We saw in the video the technology on the left, but just to highlight the technology on your right is the old style that they have been doing this for a century. But the problem with the technology is that the epiphytes, they grow on the blades of the seaweed and actually change the taste of the seaweed. So they came up with this method here, and the beauty of this method is that actually you can invert the net. So what here, it's exposed to the air. So every 6 hours, when the tide changes, the farmer goes there and they flip these nets. So the epiphytes doesn't grow, good food quality. So again, the process here that they call the next generation of floating nets, it's based to optimize the quality of the food, not the yield. So keep that in mind. So then they farm the seaweed and they bring the boats. So this was right the day that we were there. There was an auction. Unfortunately, I deleted the video to not make it too long. But that boat there, the seaweed is about 15 bags, 120 kilos each. They were sold for $14,000. So if high quality on the right, low quality, $9,000 on the left. So if you follow my calculation here, it gives you a flavor of how much the seaweed costs per kilo. But I want to make sure that you see the carbohydrate cost. And the problem with this piece, the gem, is that it doesn't have much carbohydrates. It's only 30–40%. There are seaweed species that have about 80%. So if you want to do this as a carbohydrate to generate commodity chemicals such as ethanol, that's not the right seaweed. And that's not the right method either. Whoa, I'm way behind. Okay, but let me just talk very quickly about the processing. When you get the seaweed, you go through process here of washing the seaweed. You saw that in the video as well. And then you wash with fresh water, and then you dry. This is extremely energy intensive again. And if you use seaweed for something else, basically you can bypass a lot of these processes here. And then there's the product development. That's the seaweed. I visit this factory. That's what we got at Costco. 100% goes to Costco, actually. It's a good market. Actually, my number is a little bit out of date because I heard in the video that was $1 billion. It's great, but still very small. If you think about the whole industry, $1 billion. And the thing is because it's this very small niche, this culinary niche here. So what we learned? We learned there's a lot of inefficient subsidies. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. Sorry, my throat's dry. High energy. I talk about energy a lot. If you really want to use the seaweed as a feedstock to replace fossil fuel, we have to optimize this process. There's too much energy consumption. You pump water, then warm up the water, then you dry the seaweed, then you put in the freezer. It's just too much. If you do a life cycle analysis, it's not going to make it. Government subsidies, I thought, was another problem because, as we know, everything that we provide subsidies and protectionism, actually we limit innovation. And that's what's happening here. So this is some sort of the points here that kind of shows what could be done instead. And 2 points that I want to highlight, perhaps the first one, there's methods now that do all the seeding, the hatchery, actually in the ocean. That's one way that you can bypass the whole hatchery part. And finally, the point on the bottom, as I said, we need to prioritize decision-making through life cycle analysis to really understand the carbon footprint and technical and economic analysis rather than government subsidies. So just to finalize, is it possible to really do this large-scale seaweed production? Is that a reality? And I think actually, yes. I learned that from South Korea because the focus is in the quality. And it's very traditional. It's very difficult to break that down. So perhaps there are other ways to do, other countries that are not so focused on the traditions that's going to allow us to develop the technology that's going to allow to upscale, such as an example here in the ship that's basically cutting and drying the seaweed offshore. Thank you very much. I've never been to South Korea. Amazing place, really respectful, kind people. It gave me a little bit of hope, everything that's happening here, that relationships are not based on a game of cards. Amazing people I was very excited about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Rod Fujita. I actually retired from the Environmental Defense Fund back in last summer, and I'm now a consultant to various entities interested in the blue economy and ocean conservation and seaweed. So we've heard a lot of great talks about aspects of the blue economy, and what I wanted to do during my time slot is take a step back and think about this very provocative question that the organizers posed to us panelists. Can the blue economy generate livelihoods, restore ocean health, and combat climate change in ways that are safe and ethical? And, I was ruminating on this while I was preparing this talk, and I came to an unsatisfying answer. It depends, right? So the answer is no if the blue economy continues to replicate the conventional economy that's resulted in environmental problems, climate change here on land. So if we keep doing the same thing, we can't expect a different result in the ocean. But the answer is yes, if we can view the blue economy as an opportunity to change those mental models, to manifest different kinds of economic activities and manifest a different paradigm about how to do business. Well, going backwards here, we don't want to do that. So my claim is that the blue economy today, it largely reflects the conventional economy. It's dominated by oil and gas extraction. There's a lot of shipping. There's a bunch of ports. There's tourism. There's cables all over the place. It generates livelihoods, but it's not restoring ocean health or combating climate change. And although there are a few blue economy sectors that are making some progress toward becoming sustainable, like seafood, there's been great progress in fisheries, which I worked on for 30 years. There are many, many more fisheries that are sustainable today than there were 30 years ago. And you've heard a lot about these very encouraging developments in the seaweed economy and in renewable energy. And there are even some examples scattered around the world of economic systems that are truly regenerative in that they're not extractive, they give back to the ocean. But the blue economy today is neither sustainable or regenerative. The blue economy of tomorrow, if we want to realize this vision, depends on whether we can implement different mental models and a different paradigm that fit our current context. So if the vision is this, a blue economy that generates these livelihoods, protects ocean ecosystems, and combats climate change, then how do we get there? Clearly, this paradigm of extraction in a linear fashion without any regeneration is not consistent with this vision. And sustainability, which arose in the 90s with the Brundtland Commission, is an okay paradigm to control economic activity when the resources are in okay shape, right? You can sustain production if the base of production and the processes are healthy, but we're not there. You know, in the last 50 years, there's been very extensive degradation of those life-supporting processes around the world. And the climate change issue is going to require both rapid decarbonization of the economy and the active removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And that's going to entail the protection of these blue carbon ecosystems that we've been destroying, like mangroves and seagrasses and seaweed beds. So neither the sustainability paradigm or the status quo economic paradigm is going to get us to where we want to be. What do economies do? They got to provide food, industrial feedstocks to make products, to generate livelihoods. But if it's going to be regenerative, it's also got to restore marine ecosystems and reduce greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. If we're going to realize this vision, and what are the safe and ethical ways to do that? The good news is that we know how to do these things. We know how to make food from the ocean in a regenerative way. We know how to create feedstocks. You just heard from Thiago about the value of seaweed as a regenerative feedstock for industry. And we even know how to remove carbon and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in a regenerative way. I won't dwell on this. You saw a much more beautiful representation of regenerative food production from the ocean, but suffice it to say, we have been doing this for millennia on small scales. It's slowly scaling up in some areas where we mimic ecological processes that give back and regenerate the processes of production, and thereby can create food in this regenerative way that heals ocean ecosystems rather than extracts from them. But it's kind of small in scale. So what do we need? We need more examples to tell the story about how to do regenerative food production from the ocean. We need new kinds of financial instruments that recognize the values of these regenerative systems that are not monetized currently, and that kind of can bring long-term benefits that accrue from regenerative economic activity into the present. We can do this. We know how to invent financial instruments that do exactly that. We need new markets for these ecosystem services, and we need stronger governance to create that value around the non-market goods and services that marine ecosystems provide. We want to go forward, not backward. Okay. So, and when it comes to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to try to achieve our goals for stabilizing the climate, there are a lot of different ways under discussion. There are a lot of terrestrial approaches too, but most of them treat carbon dioxide as a waste product, a pollutant, and they're treating the ocean as a dumping ground for that pollutant. Can we reframe that in a way that is regenerative? Of all those ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere, there's only one that sort of treats the carbon as a resource and can generate livelihoods and profits currently without depending on the emergence of new carbon markets, which are problematic because the science around carbon sequestration by these systems is quite uncertain. We know seaweeds remove some carbon from the atmosphere, and we know that it sequesters some of that carbon. And while it's true that seaweed absorbs carbon very, very rapidly, they're among the most productive organisms in the world, they lose a lot of that carbon. They're tasty. Everybody in the ocean likes to eat seaweed. It has no lignin, it has no wood. It can't put the carbon away for decades like trees or mangroves can. So all that carbon goes, a lot of the carbon goes back into the marine food web where it's remineralized to carbon dioxide, and some of that goes back into the atmosphere. So the amount of carbon dioxide that's sequestered by seaweeds is always going to be a variable and sometimes small fraction of the total carbon absorbed by the seaweed during its lifetime. We can increase this climate mitigation benefit of seaweed and make it a truly regenerative way to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And this is how we do it. We make products out of it, just as Thiago was talking about. So it's now possible to turn all that sargassum that we heard about washing up on the shores of Jamaica, causing big issues with tourism and emitting methane, because when it's dumped into a landfill, it decomposes to carbon dioxide and methane. Let's make bricks out of it and store that carbon for several decades. You've heard from the film that you can turn seaweed polysaccharides into resins that can be manufactured into a variety of different plastic products, replacing fossil fuel substrates, thereby avoiding all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with turning petroleum, a fossil fuel, into plastic that you throw away as soon as you use it. One of the more promising products is biostimulants. Seaweeds have amazing properties when they're applied to terrestrial plants. We don't quite understand why, but you get very large increases in crop yield, crop quality, crop resilience to drought, water use efficiency, many other benefits. And so to the extent that farmers reduce their dependence on using chemically produced fertilizer, which is extremely energy intensive, and results in greenhouse gas emissions on both the front end, when you make the nitrogenous fertilizer, and on the back end, when you apply it to land and it runs off into the ocean and turns into nitrous oxide, we can spare all of those greenhouse gas emissions if farmers replace fertilizers with seaweed biostimulants or use less fertilizer when they see these benefits in crop yield when you use seaweed biostimulants. And finally, some seaweeds have compounds in them that dramatically reduce methane emissions from cattle. This is a major, major source of radiative forcing and climate change. And it's our best opportunity to slow the rate of climate change rapidly, because methane is not only a very potent greenhouse gas, it has a short atmospheric lifetime. So that if we can reduce those methane emissions, we can dramatically reduce the rate of climate change. There's a lot of uncertainty and challenges around all of these product categories. I'm glad to see there's large, well-funded efforts to try to tackle these technical and economic questions underway right now. So let me leave you with this. What's the answer? Can we produce a blue economy that produces livelihoods, restores ocean ecosystems, and mitigates the climate in a safe, effective way? Yeah, we can. It's going to be powered by renewable energy. We're going to produce food from it using regenerative aquaculture. We're going to make industrial feedstocks from regenerative sources instead of fossil fuels. And we're going to remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in regenerative ways through seaweed farming and making products. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Dan Okamoto. I'm a assistant professor in integrative biology. I'm a marine ecologist, and we work on seaweeds, fish, all sorts of stuff in coastal ecosystems. But I'm a biologist, and I work with a lot of communities, and we spend a lot of time communicating with communities about what their interests are that drive a lot of the questions that we have as a scientist. And there's a lot of optimism and there's a lot of pessimism about the nature of the blue economy. We've heard a lot about seaweeds in this space in particular. And anytime there's an expansion of a market, oftentimes there's opportunities for the more nihilistic and the more optimistic folks that move into that space. Combination of snake oil and real opportunities for equity, expansion, and economic opportunity. And I just came back from a meeting in Sitka, Alaska, where they had just completed a mariculture meeting. And there's a lot of questions about seaweed growers and about what the future looked like. And I was curious, Alexandra, in your interactions in reporting on these questions about what the perceptions are right now about the future, given you're kind of coming into this winter of seaweed.
Yeah, Alaska is a really interesting. I wasn't able to get up there for my reporting, but it's a place I think where you see a lot of these questions come up because it's so predisposed to growing kelp really well. It has cold waters, it has a lot of nutrients that kelp wants, but it's not connected to the lower 48, as they call it. And they also have a maritime workforce and indigenous groups that have seen a huge decline in the native fish populations. They've seen huge changes up there with the warming waters and acidification. But yeah, a lot of the money that's been going to Alaska has been for research and not for infrastructure and or processing, which would allow seaweed to kind of enter the different applications that we're talking about, whether that's plastics or fuel. You need investment into that infrastructure. And I think in the US right now, a lot of folks, in California, it's illegal to farm seaweed inshore. So there's some really cool seaweed farmers that are doing like tank culture supported by Hog Island, we're going to have their oysters later, which is really cool. But I think there's a lot of legislative challenges right now. And I think that if there could be changes around that, I think that's what a lot of people in the seaweed economy are saying to me.
Yeah, and I'd ask the same question, I think, in a slightly different perspective. Thiago, having traveled the world now, kind of thinking about some of these seaweed questions, there's a lot of disparities between what's happening in the U.S. and what's happening in East Asia and Southeast Asia. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about, what you presented up there and the perceptions of where things are going and the opportunities.
Yeah, I'm actually also having an example from Alaska because we went to this meeting in Sacramento and I was talking to a farmer from Alaska and he was saying that, yeah, they do this amazing work, harvesting the seaweed, but they don't have a place to process. So seaweed has 90% water, and they didn't have a place to basically dewater the seaweed. And because they're so far from the mainland, the lower 48, they were actually struggling because they didn't have a way to sell their product, before dewatering. So yeah, based on having co-ops that all the farmers could use some of those facilities to process their products so they could increase their value, aggregate the value when they sell the biomass would be fantastic. So this is kind of one perspective that I had from Alaska. And now going to South Korea, of course, there's an acceptance there. There's a whole industry that it's in there just for over 100 years. But they also struggle in many ways. Of course, there's the warm waters. And also, as we know, South Korea is an aging population. The young folks, they do not want to work in those tough conditions. So actually, most of the labor comes from Southeast Asia, because labor, it is expensive in Korea, which contrasts to places like Indonesia, where it tends to be much cheaper. So they also are struggling in many ways there in the sort of this labor capacity. Still, there is a lot of mechanization, automation that has to happen. But there is that acceptance, and there is as I was trying to point it out, these government subsidies is really strong, and it's strong across the entire value chain. One thing that I forgot to mention is that the farmer actually is protected on the downside. So when the yield goes down due to sort of variations in the season, mostly through warm waters, the government provides the subsidy. So the farmer only gets the upside, is protected by the downside. Of course, that's not the case here and in other places. So there are a lot of contrasts that between what we see in Asia and what we see sort of in Alaska, which the place that I'm from in the United States.
Yeah, and Rod, it's interesting you've been working in this seaweed space around the world for probably longer than most of us. And I'm interested the perceptions of the top-down versus bottom-up, space in terms of there's a little bit of movement here, both in the West and the East, but the perceptions of how you move to a space that you're talking about in those dimensions.
Yeah, what I see over and over again is this sort of unvirtuous cycle, this dynamic wherein these new products are really exciting, but nobody really wants to invest in them because the demand is not strong enough. The demand is not strong enough because the understanding of the value proposition is not there. Everybody needs more biomass, but the farmers don't want to produce more biomass because there's too much uncertainty and risk to create a seaweed farm here in the U.S. because of permitting, complexity and costs and other barriers. So it's not intractable. I think there are some financing models that blend different kinds of capital with different expectations of return and different tolerance of risk and so forth. There are some innovative offtake agreements emerging in Europe, for example, wherein the processor uses revenues expected from making a biostimulant or bioplastic at the back end, uses that revenues to pay for offtake agreements, basically forward purchase contracts with seaweed farmers. That takes a lot of the risk out of their business, and now the seaweed farmers are responding by expanding their farms. So there are ways to kind of short circuit that dynamic and resolve some of these economic issues that are impeding the scaling up of some of these very promising seaweed product categories.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too in that when you're thinking about some of those questions, one of the questions that was coming up from this trip I just had in Sitka was, what are you doing, why are you doing it, and who are you doing it for? And anytime there's kind of a new market in this space, there are these opportunities for both extraction and exploitation. And I don't know, Alexandra, if you have perceptions about how the growers in particular are feeling about some of those dynamics as well.
I mean, most of the seaweed farmers that I met are in it because they love it. Like, you know, they're making at most $30,000 a year. It's usually a supplemental kind of farming. They're operating on 1 to 2 acres. That's kind of what the face of seaweed farming in the United States is right now. There is, you know, ocean rainforests offshore farm, which is only permitted for research. We still don't have any commercially viable offshore permitting paths in the EEZ of California yet in the United States. But I would say the people at the grassroots are very much interested in kind of, you know, I think you saw that enthusiasm in the movie. You know, people are eating, they always eat the kelp. Like, I've been on a lot of boats with a lot of seaweed. The farmers love to eat the kelp. Like, and you don't see that in a lot of industries. Like, there's a real joy and enthusiasm around it. There are some people, I think, who are taking advantage of the funding opportunities and using that to kind of like greenwash themselves. But I would say that's few and far between.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that's certainly true. It's been my experience here in the U.S., but globally it's a real mosaic. So you've got your commodity growers, you know, who are just price takers on the global market in Asia. You've got farms like the one in Lombok that are trying something new, that have a real mission that includes climate mitigation and regenerating the ocean, and everything in between. You've got indigenous folks in Chile who are growing seaweed not for any market purpose whatsoever, but really to just pull carbon out of the atmosphere to heal the earth. So we're in this is why I think we're at a crossroads with the blue economy, right? That we have this mosaic of different models. Which paradigm is going to dominate? So far, it's the linear extraction paradigm, but we now have enough models to know better, and the choice is ours.
And yeah, Thiago, I guess one question is thinking about the current paradigm we're in, where we're looking down the future of a potentially reduced funding from, from the top down, and opportunities where there's maybe philanthropic or increased investment from companies, but where there's a lack of basic research in many ways for whether it's processing or other scales. Like, what's the future in that space?
I think we all puzzle about that, right, those days. I think public-private partnership is the best way to go at this moment. I have 1 minute, just from you, for the whole group. So the Energy and Bioscience Institute, for example, it's 100%, public-private partnership. We managed to do applied science and have a focus on the commercialization. I think that's a path as well. Yes, we do need to do a lot of basic research, particularly in terms of sequencing, genetics, the genome editing, modifying to try to make better heat-tolerant species and so on and so on. But there is a commercial aspect as well, and coming with new strategies, new technologies to basically mimic what has been done in agriculture in terms of precision agriculture there is space to do that in aquaculture as well. And I always think there's basically three industries that can really move the needle here. Because, yeah, biostimulant is great, but it's a very small market. The three industries are energy, of course, construction, and agriculture. Those are the ones that can really move the needle here. And back to what Rod was saying, we are in this chicken and egg thing, well, is the supply the problem or is the demand? Well, it's a little bit of both, but if you put some of these main energy players into the loop, they are gonna drive the supply, they are gonna drive supply, and I think that's perhaps the way to go. But yes, we do need to work on the public-private partnership, especially the situation we are here.
Great. Well, thank you. Those were wonderful presentations, and thanks for the panel.
Thank you.